So, what makes some kids more vulnerable than other kids? And these are the things that I would call risk factors. So, what makes a kid more at risk of sort of having these problems? And I'm not going to be able to tell you an A leads to B with the outcome C sort of story. There's no conduct problems are too variable and too complex for me to tell you this really clean story. But what I'm able to do is tell you some of the risk factors that have the most support that we sort of that come up again and again in the science as being as placing kids at a particular vulnerability for these sorts of problems. And so I'm going to talk about it. This is the point at which we bring in the nature, the nurture sort of question, which is without a doubt the most common question I'm asked if somebody finds out when I research disruptive behavior. It's like, okay, so what is it? Are they born that way? Is it their genetics? Or is it how they were raised? Is it the parenting? And you will never receive a like satisfactory response from a researcher on this topic because it's always going to be both. And so this is the metaphor that I'll sometimes use is that yes, a child is coming to the table with a particular genetic predispositions or genetic vulnerabilities, much like the tea leaves in a tea bag. All of their potential is sort of is encased in that tea bag, but you do not get the flavors, the smells, the all of the different characteristics of the tea unless it's under particular environmental conditions, aka hot water. You pour in cold water, you're not going to get the same effect. You leave it without the water, once again, you're going to get a particular smell, but you're probably not going to get the flavor. So it's under particular conditions that these genetic predispositions come alive, right? So it's the interaction is the point. And so when we think about what the child's bringing to the table, what's inside that tea bag, we're thinking things like temperament. And so any of you who are parents would know that your kid is coming into the world with a particular way of responding. And so this is about, how reactive they are to the world around them, even sort of immediately after they're born, how reactive they are, how able they are to be soothed by you, soothed by others, as well as what's happening for them psychologically or cognitively, right? And then when we talk about the environment, we're going to focus on the immediate environment that we probably have more control over, but it's also really important to remember that kids live in a particular context, so their socioeconomic status in particular, if they come from a disadvantaged background, that is going to also have an impact. So that's also a risk factor. So we have this interaction between nature or nurture, genes and environment, child factors or environmental factors, whatever you want to call it, right? So if we think about a kid, in general, we're talking about conduct problems in general now. The types of child factors that increase vulnerability to having conduct problems or having disruptive behavior is when you have a child who has what we call a difficult temperament. So after they're born, they seem to be more reactive to the world around them. They seem to be more irritable or more bothered by things. And correspondingly, they're more difficult to soothe, to get to sleep, to calm down. It takes longer for that. So that's sort of a difficult temperament as opposed to something like an easy temperament, which we might describe a kid who's less irritable, less reactive, easier to soothe. So that increases vulnerability. Another thing that increases vulnerability is something called a hostile attribution bias. So these are just like fancy words for describing a tendency, I guess, or a style of thinking where for most people, if something happens to you that's like pretty neutral. So say I'm building Legos on a desk or I'm writing a piece of work on the desk and someone walks past me and their hip bumps the desk and it makes me knock over my tower or sort of mess up my writing. Typically, people will sort of look at what's happened and maybe feel a bit, oh, it's like, that's annoying, but assume that it's an accident, right? Assume that the person didn't mean to, or they didn't do it on purpose. However, if you have something called a hostile attribution bias, what we tend to see is this style of thinking where you experience those neutral events and you assume you're biased towards thinking that person is being hostile towards you, that they've done it on purpose, that they did it specifically to hurt you, or to upset you, right? And so you can see then, if you have a tendency to misinterpret these neutral things as being like threatening or being hostile, you're going to be more likely to retaliate, to lash out, or to run away. You're more likely to respond to the threat. And I put this up here because this is really common in our kids who have conduct problems, that they assume that somebody is doing something that's threatening to them, that's deliberate, that's intentionally going to hurt them. And this is something that we can shift these biases. We can get kids to start thinking about things in different ways. But I also put this up here, and this brings in a little bit more of the environment, because we see this often in kids who experience a trauma background. And this makes sense because if you're in a home environment where it's dangerous for you because one of your parents might be abusive to your other parent, or your parent might be abusive to you, it makes sense for you to be on guard, right? And if anything possibly could be a threat, it's safer for you to interpret it as a threat, because that means you can either fight or you can run away, and keep yourself safe, because chances are it is going to be something that's dangerous to you. But the problem is then when a kid who's, maybe in this type of environment then comes to the school environment where that's not the case anymore. There's very little risk that somebody else is going to hurt them or be threatening. It's like this overactive car alarm system that goes off even when the threat isn't there, just to sort of wind blowing past the car, the alarm goes off. So even though it makes sense for kids in their home environment to think like this, it does have potential to cause problems when it sort of gets activated at school. So this is sort of going beyond the content a little bit, but because we're, I think, increasingly becoming aware of trauma as something that's really important to consider and keep in mind, this is sort of related to those sort of early experiences. So once again, it's always in interaction. You also see these kids, there's this really sort of strong association with having lower verbal intelligence, so the ability to put your thoughts into words, to express how you're thinking and how you're feeling. That can really undermine your ability then to tell somebody what the problem is, to negotiate with somebody else and resolve conflict. You tend to do and show rather than tell and manage. So once again, this is putting you at sort of higher risk of having these disruptive behavior problems. And then this is sort of where we bring in, how before I was talking about how ADHD makes you more vulnerable to disruptive behavior problems. This is sort of how this comes into it. So if you struggle to regulate your own behavior because you're impulsive, you act on urges, to monitor and to plan, to make decisions, that will put you at risk of having, of being aggressive, of breaking the rules, of defying sort of what people tell you is expected of you and what you're meant to be doing. So that poorer self-control, poorer ability to problem solve, to stop what you're doing, think about the potential solutions, pick a solution, and then evaluate that solution. If you're less able to do that, there's a risk for you. So that's sort of like some of the things, and this is a non-exhaustive list, but some of the things that make one kid more vulnerable than another kid. If they have all of these things, they're particularly vulnerable. But these things aren't a guarantee. If you have a kid who has a difficult temperament, does not lead to B. Biology isn't destiny, but it just increases risk, right? Because what happens is that these things unfold in interaction with the environment, so the hot water. And the thing that we speak about most, particularly when kids are young, in terms of the environment, the immediate environment, is the type of parenting or caregiving they receive. And so there's this really strong connection that's demonstrated again and again and again in the literature about how types of parenting styles increase the risk of having conduct problems. So if your parent isn't involved with you, doesn't monitor you, doesn't supervise you, that's a really big risk factor. If your parent is harsh with you, so yells at you a lot, criticizes you, is physically aggressive to you, so uses corporal punishment, or is abusive, on the sort of end of the spectrum, you're more risk of having conduct problems. If your parent is minimally reinforcing, so if they're not often using praise, if they're not often affectionate, if they don't often notice the good things that you're doing, you're at risk of conduct problems. And if your parent is inconsistent in how they discipline you, if sometimes this is a boundary, but other times it's not, if sometimes you get in trouble for this, but sometimes you don't, that increases your risk of having conduct problems. So these types of parenting styles are really clearly linked to why conduct problems develop, and then why they sort of keep going over time, why they persist. The other thing is that in the environment, if you're not exposed as a kid to healthy models of socialization or healthy models of interaction, if you don't see, say, your parents engaging in healthy like problem solving or conflict resolution, if you're not seeing your parents talk about their feelings, or sort of manage the other person's feelings, you might not be getting the exposure that you need to develop healthy social skills and healthy ways of sort of interacting with other people. So if you live in quite a chaotic or absent or abusive family, you're not exposed to these healthy ways of being in relationships with other people. It's going to affect the development of your social emotional skills, right? So these are some of the key environmental, and this is like not, again, this is ignoring, this is immediate family, we're ignoring the bigger things like SES, like structural racism, all of those things. Also because us as individuals, one-on-one people, these are the things that we might have a bit more control over as opposed to disadvantage or whatever. So a couple of examples there of the child driven and the environment driven risk factors that we might consider as important. And I'm hoping that as I'm talking through them, you're sort of having a few like moments where you think, I wonder if that's relevant to my management. That's what I was saying before. This is really, I find it interesting, but I think it's really only interesting insofar as it gives us clues about, well, it gives us empathy for understanding where particular kids are coming from, and empathy will help us be more patient, but it also gives us clues about what a kid might need for us to break the cycle, right? If they are characteristically, temperamentally like this, what does that mean for how we manage them? What does that mean for how we're trying to upskill them in order to reduce these conduct problems? And critically, we have evidence that there are some different risk factors for the kids who also go on to have the limited prosocial emotions. So what we tend to see in terms of child factors, before I spoke about a difficult temperament, so being reactive and sort of irritable, what we'll often see for these kids is much more of a fearless temperament. So this is the type of child who seeks out danger, seeks out thrills, and so what you see is a lot more risky behavior. And what this is really sort of getting at is this sense of fearlessness. So low sensitivity to threat and to punishment, which is the next thing I put up here, where the reason why I probably wouldn't go climb a tree is because there is fear in me that something will happen and I will fall out of the tree and I will get hurt. I don't like the feeling of being up high. I find that quite aversive and uncomfortable. It's not something that I enjoy. But if I had more of a fearless temperament, the enjoyment that would come with that risk, the thrill, the danger of being really up high is one thing. And then the other thing is if I did fall, the threat, the pain I wouldn't experience as intense. I wouldn't react as much to that. I'm more insensitive to that punishment. Similarly, so if I got caught speeding and I was pulled over, I wouldn't experience the physical changes or the psychological response to being pulled over by a police officer, right? that maybe a more typical person would. So we all sort of fall on one end of the spectrum from like quite fearful in our temperament to quite fearless. And if you have a fearless temperament, that's a vulnerability to having these limited pro-social emotions, right? That you're more insensitive to punishment, which means you don't learn as well from punishment. So you're going to be doing the same behaviors. Because the reason why we stop doing behaviors after we get in trouble for them is because we don't like the feeling of getting in trouble. So we avoid that feeling by not doing it again. But if you're less sensitive to that feeling, there's not that sort of internal stopgap to prevent you from doing it again. So you learn less well. On the flip side, there's some evidence that these kids not only are less sensitive to punishment, but they're also very motivated by reward. So they overvalue rewards in the sense of they place a lot of value relative to other things, other people's feelings, or the negative consequences of getting the reward. And sort of altogether then there's this difficulty of linking what they've done with the negative consequences of what's happened, either for them. So they've gambled and they've lost their money. Linking one behavior to the outcome is more difficult for these types of people, as well as sort of the impact on other people, the negative consequences for other people as well. So there's this real sort of specific, I guess, learning style is how we can talk about it, but it's temperamentally based, right? It's what sort of raises the heart rate and the breathing. It's very sort of based in that. And then the other thing that is really specific to these kids, kids, adults, whatever, across the board with these limited pro-social emotions is that they have these sort of emotional deficits, right? So these kids are less likely to notice when there's emotional stuff happening in the environment. So like their attention is less likely to be grabbed. They're less likely to recognize when somebody else is showing distress, in terms of if you see a face that is scared or surprised, they're less likely to be able to accurately recognize fear and less likely to accurately recognize sadness. So they're like the distress cues, which is like, I'm hoping sort of your minds are working, which is important. If somebody is confusing surprise and fear, once again, that cue to change my behavior, to shift things, is going to become more muddled, right? They're less likely to react physically. So, their heart rate, their skin, their sweating response to something that's emotional. So I show a kid a picture of a kitten that has a really injured, manky eye. First of all, most people's attention would be grabbed by that and they would fixate on that and they would have a physiological response to that. We don't see that in these kids. And then the other thing that we see is this like lower likelihood of them seeing something emotional and then doing something about it. So responding pro-socially with a helpful behavior, getting somebody a date or getting somebody a drink of water in response to somebody else being in distress. So this is like a really robust finding. And so these things, these risk factors seem quite specific to this group of kids who have pro-social emotion. So they're quite distinctive, right? We don't tend to see this with the other kids who have conduct problems, which gives us some really important clues about what sort of management things might be important to focus on with these, with this particular type of kid. And then I won't spend too long on this, but the environmental factor that has quite a bit of evidence for being important is still, like when we spoke about before, the dysfunctional parenting stuff. So the inconsistency, the harshness, the poor monitoring and supervision, all of that stuff is still important. So this is not to say that that isn't important. But what seems to be added into the mix here is when there's really low closeness or really low warmth in the caregiver-child relationship. So when parents aren't verbally affectionate or physically affectionate with their kids, when they have thoughts and feelings that are much more critical about their children, they feel less emotionally connected to them because they think that their kid is, there's something wrong with them, or they're always going to be like this, or it's who the child is as a person as opposed to what the child does. So when there's that lack of emotional connection, these kids are particularly at risk, which makes sense. These kids struggle with their emotions and emotional connection. If then their main sort of relationship withdraws, and isn't close with them, there's no opportunities then for them to learn about how to be in a relationship with another person, how to be emotionally connected with somebody else. So they're not getting those foundational experiences. What's interesting is that more and more and more is the science demonstrating the same thing with a student-teacher relationship. In particular, there's this lack of closeness in student-teacher relationships for kids who have these limited pro-social emotions, and less so with the kids who are more typical, have sort of the conduct problems, but these intact. There's a lot of conflict with those. The conflict goes across the board, so you still struggle to manage them. But what tends to be the case is that despite there being hard and having conflict with them, there's also this sense of connection with them, of warmth, of affection, of closeness that we really see lacking with these limited pro-social emotions. So to sort of bring it all together is sort of this model, because I've spoken to you about a couple of things, but this sort of brings it all together, I think, in a pretty succinct way of understanding where these limited pro-social emotions might come from. So say you have a young kid, so I'm talking, 1-year-old, 1.5-year-old to preschool 2-year-old, who does something to hurt somebody else, bites another child. What happens usually in the environment is that the victim, the person who they've bitten, shows some sort of distress. They get scared, they get upset, they cry. There's also some sort of indication from the environment, whether that's from a parent or an educator, that the child has done the wrong thing. So the face changes, the voice changes, they might actually get in trouble, might be separated. So there's some sort of threat cue. And what happens then is that the combination of these two things, seeing my victim become a distress and then getting in trouble in whatever form that is, causes me to feel negative emotions, this sort of undifferentiated sense of, I don't like that, I don't like seeing this person upset, I don't like getting in trouble, doesn't feel good. And what happens is that over time, that sort of undifferentiated negative emotional state develops into what we would call our conscience or our moral emotions, develops into a sense of feeling guilty or empathy, to the point where even just picturing doing something that hurts somebody else or violates a rule causes us to feel those negative emotions, which stops us from doing it in the first place. So we empathize so much with the person or the thing that we, have hurt, or we feel really bad about doing the wrong thing. That happens. We have these experiences where kids over and over and over again that eventually, that's why we don't all cruise around just breaking rules and hurting people willy-nilly if that's what we want, because we have this conscience, we have this internal stopgap, and this is the theory of where that develops. But if you have a kid, like our limited pro-social emotions kids, who aren't super sensitive to others' emotions, either aren't paying attention to them, don't notice them, or if they do notice them, can't recognize them, or if they do recognize them, don't really care about them, and they're punishment insensitive, as in they get in trouble or something hurts them, and they don't feel the pain as badly, or it doesn't make their bodies feel bad, you're not going to get that initial negative emotional state, which means there's no foundation then to build up the conscience, which means that these behaviors, that internal stopgap doesn't exist, and these behaviors potentially will keep going and potentially become worse. So that's sort of the theory, I guess, at the moment of where the pro-social emotions come from themselves. The take-home messages being that we can start thinking with more nuance about why these kids are the way they are, and that from one kid to another, these things might differ. And the reason that we care is because the way that we tend to manage, and I've worked with a lot of parents where this has been the case, the way that we tend to manage or respond to disruptive behaviors isn't going to be equally effective for all of these kids. And in particular, the kids with the limited pro-social emotions may not respond in the way that we might want or might expect. And so the conclusion being that we have to really tailor our management strategies for each kid that comes in, and knowing or suspecting that they might struggle with these limited pro-social emotions can give us some clues about what strategies may be more or less helpful to implement. So that's why we should care.